So, hey guys. So, Ricardo Keyblade Sand here, and today I want to talk to you guys about a bit of a theory regarding the Legend of Zelda timeline, how the game The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time actually created at least two downfall timelines. So, let's get into this. So, when discussing the Legend of Zelda official timeline, we all know how controversial, specifically the downfall timeline, can be. Um, and we know that the source of that controversy is the fact that, unlike with the child and adult timelines, we never actually saw the event that spawned the downfall timeline, or so we think, anyway. And I'll get to that in a second. That's part of the theory. So, according to the official Nintendo lore, the downfall timeline spawned as a result of Link being defeated by Ganon in the final battle. But of course, we in game never actually saw Link get defeated by Ganondorf. I mean, sure, you, the player, can lose, but that's generally not treated as canon, you know? I mean, in every Zelda game, and most games in general, you can lose. So, why doesn't Wind Waker spawn a downfall timeline? Why doesn't Twilight Princess spawn a downfall timeline? So, yeah, that's the gist of the controversy. However, there are 2 points in Ocarina of Time where we, like in the story actually, where it actually could have spawned a downfall timeline. And these 2 points in the story are 2 points where Link was actually required to travel back in time to his childhood. For those who have played Ocarina of Time, you know that throughout the game, like once you pick up the Master Sword, you can optionally travel back to your childhood and back to the adult era. But for the most part, you actually don't have to go back in time once you've become an adult. But there are 2 points in the story where the game actually requires you to go back in time. And these 2 points are: first, in order to enact the infamous Song of Storms paradox, and secondly, during the beginning of the Spirit Temple. So let's talk about the Song of Storms paradox first. So as we know, Link started the game as a child in Kokiri Forest. He gathered the spiritual stones and the Ocarina of Time. He entered the Door of Time, picked up the Master Sword, got sealed for 7 years, and woke up in his adult form. Upon waking up as an adult, he cleared several dungeons, and then he found his way to the windmill in Kakariko Village. There he met the windmill man, known as Guru in Majora's Mask, but yeah, I'll just call him Guru for simplicity's sake. There he met Guru, who told him that an Ocarina kid messed up the windmill 7 years ago by playing the Song of Storms. He then proceeds to teach Link the Song of Storms, and bear in mind that Link is an adult at this point when he's learning the Song of Storms. And then Link must travel back in time 7 years to his childhood so that he can play the newly acquired Song of Storms and become the Ocarina kid who messed up the windmill. This is necessary for drying up the well and getting into the bottom of the well so that he can get the Lens of Truth, which is necessary for the Shadow Temple. So, by traveling back in time in order to complete this paradox, Link would have theoretically created a timeline split, where in one timeline, Link never completed the bottom of the well, even though the well for some reason was already dried up by the time that Link was an adult. But yeah, Link would have never completed the bottom of the well, and by extension, he would have never gotten the Lens of Truth and complete the Shadow Temple, so on and so forth in that timeline. And upon Link going back in time to complete the paradox, Link would have abandoned this particular timeline. Like, we'll call this timeline in which we'll call the timeline in which Link actually learned the Song of Storms as an adult, we will call this timeline 1. Link abandoned timeline 1 when he went back to his childhood in order to actually mess up the windmill. So timeline 1 was abandoned, and the bottom of the well and the Shadow Temple were never cleared in timeline 1. So this means that Impa is never freed, and moreover, this means that timeline 1 is left without a hero. Nobody goes on to defeat Ganon in this timeline. So this timeline is abandoned, and it stands to reason that this would become a downfall timeline because Ganon's just left to his own devices. Now, in the timeline that is created because timeline 1 is the original timeline, but Link's time travel back to his childhood in order to play the Song of Storms creates a second timeline, which we will call timeline 2, in which and in timeline 2, Link actually does play the Song of Storms, completes the bottom of the well, goes on to complete the Shadow Temple, well, 7 years later anyway, because the Shadow Temple is completed when you're an adult again. So what happens is, to review, what happens is when Link abandons timeline 1, he comes back to his childhood, ending up in timeline 2. He plays the Song of Storms, messes up the windmill, dries up the well, completes the bottom of the well. Then he goes to sleep again for 7 years, and when he's an adult again, he completes the Shadow Temple. And remember, traveling to the future from his childhood does not create a timeline split. Because remember, he's just sealed in the Sacred Realm. He's just sleeping. That's basically just waiting. In fact, his body even ages. Like, going to the future is essentially just waiting. That's just waiting out the time. So that doesn't create a timeline split. So yeah, we have two timelines thus far. The timeline that Link learned the Song of Storms in as an adult, and he left that timeline and abandoned it and came to timeline 2, where he actually completed the bottom of the well in the Shadow Temple. And so, yeah, as I said, how this creates a downfall timeline, well, it creates a downfall timeline in the form of timeline 1 because Link left that timeline, and so the bottom of the well and the Shadow Temple are never cleared, and because he left that timeline, specific subsequently the Spirit Temple is also not cleared, and so Impa and Naburu never awaken as sages, and Ganon's never defeated, and timeline 1 becomes a downfall timeline. But Link is in timeline 2 now. But you will soon see that timeline 2 becomes a downfall timeline because of the Spirit Temple. As the last temple of the game, not counting Ganon's castle, Link goes to the Spirit Temple, and he's an adult at this point when he first goes to the Spirit Temple. But when he gets to the Spirit Temple, he encounters a hole, and it occurs to me that I messed up that word hole here. That should just be with the H, not the W. But well. But anyway, he encounters a hole here that is too small for him to go through as an adult. So, because of this tiny hole, he has to go back in time once again to his childhood in order to come back and complete the first part of the Spirit Temple. And then, after doing this, he then goes to sleep again for 7 years and completes the rest of the temple. So, this would create another timeline split off of timeline 2. So, now timeline 2 gets abandoned simply because of a hole. It's kind of funny to think about that. Link's just like, oh, I found a hole. It was too small, so I'm just going to abandon this timeline. And so, yeah. So now in timeline 2, even though the Shadow Temple was cleared, the Spirit Temple was not cleared in timeline 2 because he abandoned the timeline due to not being able to fit through a hole. And so Nibiru was never freed and awakened as a sage, and Ganon went uncontested in Timeline 2 as well, and so Timeline 2 becomes a downfall timeline. And also in Timeline 2, this, because the Spirit Temple was not completed, this also means that Twin Rova was never killed. Keep that in mind. Like, that's going to be relevant a little later. Also for the fact that Twin Rova was never killed in Timeline 1 either is also going to be relevant. But yeah, so Timeline 2, just like Timeline 1, becomes a downfall timeline due to being abandoned by the Hero of Time. And of course, this also creates Timeline 3, which Timeline 3 is the timeline in which Ganon was actually defeated. I'll get to that in a minute, but let's just say Timeline 3 is the one we actually formally know as the adult timeline. But I'll get to that in a moment. Like I said, keep in mind that in Timelines 1 and 2, Twin Rova was never killed. And I call those downfall timelines because those were abandoned. And the reason I emphasize Twin Rova not being killed is because in Oracle of Ages, which takes place in the downfall timeline, we actually see Twin Rova. So, funny enough, that part of the theory actually aligns. Like, we actually see Twin Rova alive in the downfall timeline. So, to review this all, basically, Ocarina of Time in total should have created at least 4 timelines. There was the original timeline in which we started the game. This was the timeline where, like, Link first woke up in Kokiri Forest and met Navi and gathered the spiritual stones and first placed the sword in the pedestal, or picked up the sword, I'm sorry, from the pedestal of time. And basically, timeline 1 spans from the beginning of the game until the time you learned the Song of Storms in the windmill, and you abandoned Timeline 1 when you actually went back in time in order to complete the Song of Storms paradox. So, yeah, you abandon Timeline 1 after learning the Song of Storms, and that creates Timeline 2. And so, in Timeline 2, you actually complete the bottom of the well and the Shadow Temple, and Timeline 2, you actually complete the bottom of the well and the Shadow Temple, and from there, Timeline 2 lasts from the bottom of the well to the time that you encounter the small hole in the Spirit Temple. That is the span of Timeline 2. And then Timeline 2 gets abandoned when you encounter that small hole and have to go back in time again to your childhood. This is when Timeline 3 is created. When Link goes back in time just so he can get through that hole in the Spirit Temple. And this is actually the timeline where we actually complete the Spirit Temple, defeat Twin Rova, and actually go on to defeat Ganon. Like, Timeline 3 is the adult timeline. Like, this is the timeline in which we actually defeat Ganon and complete the game. Like, this is the timeline that ultimately Wind Waker happens in, like, about 100 or so years later. But as we know, of course, at the end of Ocarina of Time, after you defeat Ganon, Zelda sends Link back in time, and this creates the child timeline where Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess happen. So there you have it. You have 2 downfall timelines which get abandoned, leading to a third timeline in which the Hero of Time defeats Ganon, and this timeline technically does get abandoned, but the difference here is that Link has actually defeated Ganon before abandoning the timeline, unlike in timelines 1 and 2. And you have the child timeline, which is timeline 4, in which Link lives out his childhood and, gets married and has kids, which leads up to the hero of Twilight and so on and so forth. So let's address some holes in the theory. So to review one more time, timelines 1 and 2 would be downfall timelines due to being abandoned by Link before Link could free all the sages and defeat Ganon. And timeline 3 was the adult timeline, which was technically abandoned, which was why we got Wind Waker. But he abandoned timeline 3 only after he defeated Ganon. And timeline 4 was the child timeline. So you may be thinking, if those times, if the Song of Storms paradox and the Spirit Temple, if those times created timeline splits, then why, like, if Link abandoned timeline 1 upon doing the Song of Storms paradox, then why are the forest, fire, and water temples still completed 7 years later when you return to your adulthood? Like when you go back in time after learning the Song of Storms and you complete the bottom of the well and then you go to sleep again for 7 years. Well, if you're in a second timeline, then why do you still retain your progress from the forest temple, the fire temple, and the water temple? After all, as a kid, like, Link did not complete those temples and awaken those sages as a kid. He only did that as an adult. But when Link returned to his childhood after learning the Song of Storms, he would have gone back to a point in time before he completed those temples and before the respective sages awakened. And similar logic applies to timeline 2 as well. To timeline 2 as well. When you abandon timeline 2 upon finding that hole that is too small, then theoretically all your progress, all the sages that you awakened in the temples that you cleared should not have been cleared. So why is it that even though you abandon timelines 1 and 2, why is it that upon going to sleep again and reawakening as an adult again, suddenly, like, all of a sudden, somehow you still have those sages, like those sages have still been awakened and those temples are still cleared? Well, to address that, and this is just theoretical, but maybe the sacred realm to an extent exists outside of time and can, like, save progress in a sense. Like, to give an example, in the child timeline, we know that Ganondorf somehow still retained or at least regained access to the Triforce of Power, even though in the child timeline, like, the events where Link gathered the spiritual stones and Ganon followed him into the sacred realm, that never happened in the child timeline. Even so, Ganondorf still retained access to the Triforce of Power. It's like, maybe, and you may be thinking, oh, well, that's the Triforce, not the Sacred Realm. But I'm thinking maybe because, the Triforce was originally housed inside of the Sacred Realm, maybe not just the Triforce, but the Sacred Realm itself somehow remembers what happened in, like, the previous timeline, and it sort of saves important enough events. So just like how Ganondorf somehow retained access to the Triforce upon his attempted execution, maybe in these newly created timelines, the Sacred Realm remembered that Saria had awakened as a sage, that Darunia had awakened as a sage, that Impa, that Nibiru, whoever. Like, maybe that Princess Ruto, maybe the Sacred Realm remembered that these sages had awakened. And remember, once the sages awaken, they actually go to the Sacred Realm. So the sacred, so they would have been in the Sacred Realm at least once. So maybe the Sacred Realm remembers that these people awakened as sages. And so in the newly created timelines, maybe history just so happened that even though Link himself didn't go through those temples again, maybe history just rewrote itself in those timelines so that somehow these sages just somehow awakened again, like just on their own. Just like Ganondorf just somehow got the Triforce of Power again, even though Link didn't get the spiritual stones and Ganon didn't follow Link into the Sacred Realm. Yeah. So to clear up what I mean, like maybe Ganon, or maybe let's talk about like timeline, going from timeline 1 to timeline 2, for example. So by the time he learned the Song of Storms in timeline 1, he would have already completed the Forest Temple, awakening Saria, the Fire Temple, awakening Darunia, and the Water Temple, awakening Ruto. And then he would have abandoned timeline 1. So upon abandoning timeline 1 and creating timeline 2, he would not have gone through the forest, fire, and water temples again, but sometime between his childhood in timeline 2 and him awakening as an adult in timeline 2, sometime between those 2 points, the Sacred Realm's saving progress feature, the Sacred Realm would have remembered that Saria, Ruto, and Darunia had awakened as sages in timeline 1. And so sometime while Link was asleep in timeline 2, somehow Saria, Ruto, and Darunia would have just awakened as sages on their own in timeline 2. And so the progress is saved. And maybe those memories of timeline 1, like upon them awakening, they would have also gotten the memories of timeline 1, and they would have known about their role. And I mentioned their memories because, and granted, I know non-canon alert, but I know the mangas aren't canon to the games. But I just feel that it's worth noting that in the Twilight Princess manga, Ganondorf did mention and imply that he actually knew about the events of the adult timeline, even though that was another timeline. But Ganon actually remembered those events somehow. So maybe, just like Ganon somehow retained access to the Triforce of Power, maybe the sages somehow reawakened as sages, even though Link never completed their respective temples in Timeline 2, and they somehow regained or retained access to the memories. So, to conclude, I know that this theory is not perfect, and I'm sure you could find more holes in it, but honestly, this makes more sense to me, or at least feels more satisfying to me, than just this random multiverse theory, which I'm fine with multiverse theory. I like multiverse theory, but it makes more sense than just Ocarina of Time alone spawning a downfall timeline where somehow Link was just defeated, when that could happen in just about any of the Zelda games. And yeah, so that's my theory about how Ocarina of Time creates several, not just the 3, but 4 timelines, with 2 of them being downfall timelines. I actually have some theories about more timelines in the future. Well, when I say in the future, I mean I might make a video about that in the future, because perhaps some timelines should spawn from some other games, but I'm going to leave it at this for now, just with Ocarina of Time. So, Have a nice day.